Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keegan Chetwynd. I'm the director of the Military Aviation Museum, and we wanted to thank you all for joining us this afternoon in what is one of our unusual webinars for this month. It's being done a little bit early. We normally meet at 7 p.m. on Wednesday nights, but we are meeting at 4 because we're accommodating, again, another fantastic international speaker. Tor Larsen is joining us tonight. He's actually in Norway, so it's about 10 p.m. there, if my math is right. So we're really excited to have him here with us tonight. We're going to be looking at, well, I guess it's rather today, but we're going to be looking at Norwegian pilots and their contributions to the Allied war effort. Norway, of course, was occupied by Nazi Germany. But there were still those from Norway and who chose to fight for their country and participate in the effort to free it. So our speaker tonight is Tor Larsen. He's the author of 7 books on the subject of historic aviation with a focus on Norwegian fighter pilots in World War II. 4 of those books are available in English. He lives in a small town in southeast Norway with his partner, and he's got 2 children, aged 2 and 10. He works full-time as an advisor and is a board member of the Norwegian Spitfire Foundation. And I know he's going to tell us a little bit more about their Spitfire project towards the end of the presentation. But Tor, thank you for being here with us tonight. Hope you're there with us.
Yeah, it's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak with you. And I'm sorry that I have to do this at 4 p.m. It's getting late, and I'm in Norway, so I just bear with me on that one. Okay, so first of all, it's been a while since I've been talking English for 45 minutes to an hour, so apologize for any rusty sentences or poor English. I'm going to try and do my best. So this presentation or webinar is about Norwegian pilots in World War II. Let's see if I can change my, there we go. Just going to clarify a couple of things before we get started. I could talk in general terms about this. But the more I looked into it and prepared this PowerPoint, I decided to put a focus on individual stories and their sacrifice. Just so you know that there is a whole lot more stories to be told. I basically chose the ones that I know best. I've come to know some of these guys quite well, even though I never met them. So I'm going to focus on those, and I looked through my archive of photos, and I also found a few photos of pilots and their stories that are not often told. So I'll put focus on that. Sadly, there won't be much on 330 and 333 squadron because we had 4 squadrons operating in the air over Europe. 330 were in Iceland, and 333 flew Mosquitoes and Catalinas. I chose to focus on 331 and 332 squadron flying Spitfires. So those 2 other squadrons will have to be for another time. I decided to put some images up, tell stories that evolves around these images. Honestly, no idea how long it's going to take. It may take an hour, it may take 30 minutes. Once I get going, I have no idea. So with that, let's just start. I want to take us back to 9th of April 1940. That was the day Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Back in those days, as you can see by this this photo, Norway had quite outdated Gloster Gladiators, British aircraft, because we followed a policy that most of Europe followed in those days, and that was very little focus on building a military and preparing for whatever may come. So there was basically not much economic wise for any air force or anything like that. But on Fornebu, which was an airfield just outside of Oslo, it was our main airfield. It opened in the 30s. We had about 7 airworthy Gladiators during April of 1940. We had bought some Curtiss Hawks from the States, but they were not available. They weren't put together yet. They were in boxes and crates, and they were not anywhere to be found in the air at that point. So we had to rely on these quite outdated. Although, you know, for an aircraft of its day, the Gladiator was one of its finest, you know, fighters. But you know, come 1940 with the Messerschmitts and Hawker Hurricanes and Spitfires and such, the Gladiators couldn't really put up any good fight. But this is the equipment that we had. What you're looking at on this photo is to your top left. That's Finn Torsager. And the other guy is Finn Christian Sky. I'm going to talk a bit about both. I've come to know Finn Torsager quite well because he was one of the guys that I've written a book about. So I came to know his wife quite well and his daughter well. He sadly passed away in 2000. So that's Finn. So we're going to start with Finn and what happened to him during 9th of April 1940, because he was stationed at Fornebu. He and his colleagues were living in quite poor conditions for any type of, you know, military force. But anyway, during that night of April 8 and April 9, there were rumors starting to fly around the base that there were some naval operations going on in the North Sea. They had some quite mysterious phone calls coming in from Sweden telling them that there was some sort of force going north, most likely German. They heard unknown aircrafts flying over the capital. The sirens went off in Oslo for on at least one occasion, I think. So the night was quite messy in that respect. It was just daylight when Finn Torsager was told to take one of the Gladiators up for a reconnaissance flight, and so he did. He flew south, and after a while he flew out of, because, well, there was a very low cloud base that day, so he flew over the fog basically. And after a while he spotted an unknown aircraft below him. He did not recognize the type right away. I believe that he saw the crosses on the wings. He saw that it had a double fin. So Finn decided to go for the attack, and he fired. And Finn being Finn, because he was a young guy, and these are all just young boys, and he later wrote that he found it very strange to fire his weapons towards an unknown intruder over Norway, but he had done the right thing because that was a German. He fired a few times. The German spotted him and dived into the fog, then reappeared. Finn tried again to go in for an attack, and the German just dived away again. And so he turned around and he landed at Fornebu. And from what I remember right now, they did inspect his Gladiator and they had found bullet holes in the fabric. So whoever that was, it had obviously shot back. few hours later, things were getting real serious. So the commanding officer at Fornebu ordered all 7 Gladiators to the air. She, the other person in this photo, was one of them, and the 7 Gladiators flew south, and they were faced suddenly with a huge armada of at least 50 German aircraft, and they were just seven guys in outdated Gloster Gladiators, and those 50 to 60 aircraft was just the first wave of aircraft that day. So, and that was when the leader of this group of Norwegian gladiators said those, to us at least, famous words, all meant to himself good luck. And so a dogfight took place. For Finn's part, he went in for an attack, but his weapons jammed. So disappointingly for him, he had to turn back. The reason I took a photo, I'm going to focus on this other guy here, Christian Fredrik Sky. He got into a dogfight with later to become a fighter ace called Helmut Lent. So he was in a dogfight with a Messerschmitt 110, and surprisingly, she thought that his pace and speed was up to par with the Messerschmitt 110. Not really sure if that's the case. He was hit. He was hit in the arm. He started to bleed. He knew that he had to land somewhere, so he aimed for a frozen lake. Because his arm was hit, he couldn't pull out the flaps, so he overshot the lake, and he crash landed just across the lake. The other gladiators went into the fight, and another pilot called Per Wåler, he managed to shoot down a Heinkel 111. It was later told by the Germans that they found it a bit hard to shoot on these Norwegians because they were just 7 and they were so many, so they sort of got in each other's ways. And she was actually the only guy who was shot down of the Norwegians that day. The rest of them survived. What you see on the top right corner is Finn Torshage's Gladiator, because when he flew back to Fornebu after his guns jammed, he was told that he could not land at Fornebu because the airfield was under attack, which was true. Per Wåler, which I mentioned, he had landed at Fornebu, and a Messerschmitt 110 attacked his Gladiator while on the ground and put it to a blaze. So these guys, they scattered all around. Finn landed his Gladiator on an icy lake called Mjærvann. Another guy called Dag Kron, I'll tell you more about him later. He landed on Norway's biggest lake called Mjøsa, not far from me actually. So they all survived this first attack, and for the Norwegian part, there were more flying going around up north, because we had some even more outdated Fokkers, and part of that routine was throwing bombs out manually by hand at German forces, and with that sort of equipment and a way to do it, then you stand no chance against a modern German invasion fleet. So that was about it. Okay, so I have to. I could say a lot more about 9th of April and 1940 and stuff like that. But all right, so for Finn's part, he ended up in bed with a really bad case of pneumonia. But several of his colleagues, when Norway had to give up the fight in June, they went along with the king and the crown prince on board a British ship bound for Britain. Some other guys came around, started to escape Norway a little bit later. So what we see in this photo is to your left, far left, that's another Finn. That's Finn Eriksrud. He ended up flying Mosquitoes with 333 Squadron, so not escaping 333s completely here. What you see in the middle here is Finn and Dag Kron, two Gladiator pilots from 1940, arriving in Hollywood in 1941, and their escape took them through Sweden. They took the Trans-Siberian Railway to across the Soviet Union. They got themselves to Japan, and then they took an ocean liner over to the United States, and then over to Canada and Little Norway. And so these Norwegians, and especially those with skills to fly, were sought after, and they all escaped one way or another. And what you see far right here is a photo from Canada and Toronto and Little Norway, where the Norwegians set up a training base for these pilots. So young guys from Norway, and especially these, because Norway had a huge fleet of whaling ships and all sorts. So what you had arriving at Little Norway was a lot of these sailor types, tough guys being abroad when the invasion happened. Going back to the left photo, that's Finn Eriksrud. He tried to flee through Hungary and going that way. Others simply took the short route and took small fishing vessels and stuff like that over from the west coast of Norway and over to Scotland, to Britain, and then onwards to Little Norway. The plan the Norwegian government had was to first establish a training base in France, but the war sort of caught up with them. And then they wanted to put one in Britain. And then the war sort of came there with the Battle of Britain, and then they managed to finally arrive in Canada, who willingly let them have set up a training base in Toronto, which I'm sure they were very thankful for. And guys like Finn, they instantly took an instructor's role in those early days, naturally. He later said during an interview that he was just simply told to go out and teach some guys how to use a parachute, and he had no idea about parachutes. I don't think he had that many flying hours under his belt in 1940. So, but things got organized quite quickly, and the only thing that the Norwegian pilots were quite bitter about was that they were not able to participate in the Battle of Britain. These guys in higher places, they didn't want the Norwegian pilots, the few they had, to sort of disappear in British squadrons during the Battle of Britain. But the Norwegian pilots, they were highly against that idea, and did not like it at all when they were told to take their bags and sail across the sea to Canada to train. They really wanted to fight. So that was disappointing for everyone. Just going to check my time. Yeah. Okay. So 331 Squadron forms up. This happened during the early days. Happened in late 1941. They had enough pilots, and they could now form up the first fighter squadron called 331 Squadron. And what you see on these photos are part of that first fighter wing heading back to Britain from Canada. So that photo was taken in Canada. What you see here on your right-hand side is a guy we will hear a lot about, and that's Rolf Arneberg. And this is a photo taken on their way to Britain to form up 331 Squadron. And so in those early days, in the fall of 1941, the Norwegians received poorly maintained and old Hurricanes, and they were disappointed about that too. And they were sent up north in a place called Castletown, way up in Scotland. And unfortunately, a bit later on, they were sent even way more up north in the Orkneys Island to protect the naval base Scapa Flow. So what you see here is one of those incidents that happened during those very early days. Those three guys are all fighter pilots. That's from the left is Leif Lundsten. He came from my area, so I've been doing a lot of research on him. And that's Arnt Vinden in the middle and Morten Ree, all pilots. And I'm sure this was taken in Canada or in Scotland, where everyone was so pleased to, start to fight again. And if you take a look at the bottom right, you see the tail of a Hurricane, and that's the remaining tail after Lundsten was had a mid-air with another pilot called Jens Müller. It happened during formation practice over Castletown. They were changing formation, Lundsten and Müller. And as you can see, how he managed to land that Hurricane at Castletown is beyond me, because there is no rudder, and I can barely see anything at all. But he managed to land it, but he had no control of it once he landed. So he crashed into a Spitfire from another squadron. And the funny thing is about that photo is it's one of those few items that the family of Leif Lundsten actually had when the war was over. So that's Leif Lundsten's Hurricane having crashed into quite a brand new Spitfire, I would say, from 1 to 4 Squadron, I believe it was. And so those early days in Scotland, there were a lot of practice. I know some of the pilots were feeling a bit depressed because they couldn't do anything worthwhile. One of them even wanted to go home and just be with the home front. Depression started to set in. It was cold, icy, conditions were horrible. There were no germs around, but they were training. And back in London, I'm sure they noticed that the Norwegians were extremely good at being quick at scramble. A few incidents up there. Let's see, time is running away from me already. Up left is one Ulf Wormdal, one of those losses they had up in Skabray. He was trying to mock attack some swordfish naval bombers from the Royal Navy, and he misjudged his altitude and went straight into the sea. And I remember that making a big impression on me when I was younger. What you see below to the left is one of the is a lieutenant. His call is Jon. His name is Jon Nordmo, and what you see on the top right corner photo is they had like a trip out. I think it was like March or April 1942, and they wanted a day out, and so they were like driving out to I think it was the west coast of Scotland, and suddenly this Jon Nordmo, he wanted to go for a swim, so he just took his clothes off and dove in without knowing that the currents there was horrible, so he never managed to get it back up again. So he drowned, and I wish that was made a huge impact on some of these guys. So and if you know anything about this Norwegian fighter pilot, you'll see a few familiar faces on that photo as well. Things were happening somewhere else too. They managed to form another squadron, and that was 332 Squadron, and they formed up in Yorkshire in England. And what you see top left is Finn Torshager's Spitfire, because Finn Torshager had now joined 332 Squadron. And there is two photos of another young guy. His name is Marius Eriksen, and he I was told by a former pilot of 332 that Marius Eriksen was one of the most talented guys it had ever seen in the air. He was actually just too good for his own good, and he was barely like 18. I think he was 17 when he joined up. So we're gonna hear a bit more about him later on. The 332 was early called the Hollywood Squadron because in those early days in Catterick in the spring of 1942, they had visits from Norwegian photographers. So and I'm sure some foreign ones as well, and they were, you know, posing for photographs and being in the newspapers and even used by some PR stuff back in Canada and the States. So they were quickly nicknamed the Hollywood Squadron. Those days in Skabray and Catterick would soon end because the plan was to unite the two Norwegian squadrons, 331 and 332, and send them down south. And being in, you know, south of England was like being on the front line because you could just, you know, fly over the channel, and that's where the Germans were. So the Norwegians during May 1942 were transferred to North Weald Airfield, and you can see that on your left. That's a pre-war airfield with, you know, hard runways and you know, maintenance places, and it's like the difference between this and what they had to experience up in Skabray was like totally different. And what you see in the middle here with all the Spitfires parked, that's when 331 Squadron made a stopover at Catterick, where 332 Squadron was located. And the rumors have it that the 332 Squadron guys were extremely jealous of those other guys going down south, because at that point they didn't even know that they were joining them. So the jealousy there was quite something. Bottom picture is from August of 42, and you see two Norwegian Mark V Spitfires coming into land at North Weald. And I call this Into the Fire because this is where the Norwegians really got their baptism of fire. And their wing commander was British. He was 22 years old. He was a veteran of the Battle of Britain. And he took those Norwegians, you know, going out to the Channel and, you know, over to Europe, France, Holland. And during one of those, you know, test flights, so to speak, they were shot at by a lot of flak. And one of the Norwegian pilots, quite nervously, came on the radio and said, "It's getting very close." And Scott Molden, being British and calm and everything, he just said, "I know, don't touch it." So having David Scott Molden around was a lot of comfort for these newbies. That was the Norwegians back then. What you see top right is Finn Torsager's friend, Henning Leifset, colleague from the pre-war days. And during, I think it was in July or August 42, they were going over Dunkirk. And one of the last things Henning told Finn was that he had to look after him, because this was, you know, dangerous stuff, and just to make sure that he didn't lose him over there. But you know, when they got over there, there was flak, there was enemy fighters around, and Finn lost sight of him. And the last thing he saw of Henning was that his Spitfire caught fire and crashed in the beaches at Dunkirk. So and it's one of those things that Finn wrote about in his memoirs, which I'm sure put it set some thoughts into a young man's mind. Fall of 1942, the Norwegians participated in the YEP raid, quite ill-fated, thinking general terms. There's a lot of photos here, so I'm going to go through some of them. Top right is Finn Torsager at Mansten. During the YEP raid, the Norwegians flew 4 sorties that day. They felt they were doing a pretty good job, and they were commended by the RAF for the job they had done during the YEP raid. The young man in the top middle photo is Finn's friend Wilhelm Mohr. He participated also as a squadron leader of 332, and he was shot in the leg. So when he came back to base, wanting to actually I think he came back to base and they saw he was bleeding, so he was told not to fly. But you know, that evening with everyone back home, he felt sick because he had lost a lot of blood. So I think he threw up in someone's beer glass and then fainted. So that was it for that evening. So that was the Dieppe raid, and I think from their efforts back then during those days, they were starting to get noticed by fighter command in Britain. Bottom right corner is 332 Squadron, and you have a little more on top there, sitting on the shoulders of someone. And the fall of 1942, finally they got their new Spitfires, because they had been flying the Mark V, which was inferior to the Focke-Wulf 190. And so they received brand new Spitfire Mark 9s in the fall of 1942. And you see one of them bottom left, and you see a lot of legendary pilots in this photo. You see in the photo far left is Reidar Larsen, Norwegian American. You see next to him is Knut Bakke, a jockey. You see Christian Nyre, and then you see Leif Lundsten. And by Leif Lundsten, you see Kai Birkstedt from Denmark. One of the them. He's also pictured top left. Stein Sem was a section leader with 331 Squadron, and he lost his life in December of 1942 after being attacked by Focke-Wulf 190s. And so with his death, Leif Lundsten took his spot as section leader. Final photo here is taken during, I think it was September in 1942. You have Leif Lundsten in the middle there talking to Wilhelm von Tangen. He's one of the top brass back then. And then you have another legendary Norwegian pilot beside him with his hands on his back. His name was Martin Gram. Legendary guys. Going into 1943, things were really starting to pick up for the guys in 331 and 332 Squadron. 1943 was that year 331 Squadron was the top scoring fighter squadron in Britain. 332 Squadron ended up a few places down. So what you see here is several of these guys from 331. Absolute two legends, top right, that's Svein Heggelund, Norway's top scoring fighter ace with 16 victories. Svein Heggelund, he had the best eyesight of them all. Back up in Skabray, they were shooting at seagulls apparently, and no one really managed to shoot anyone except for Svein Heggelund. He was a master shooter. Beside him is Rolf Arneberg, another legend in the Norwegian Air Force, well known for his kind behavior and fantastic leadership, and his amazing effort for what would be freedom. Top left is the American Norwegian again, Reidar Hove Olsen, extremely keen. In his logbook, he used to write short notes. For example, the dull Germans wouldn't fight today, and he extremely keen guy. Unfortunately, he lost his life in a mid-air accident in 1944, but he would definitely have been one of the most known Norwegian fighter pilots if it wasn't for his passing. And then you have a bit of a paradox or an irony, or sad irony. The bottom here is Svein Heggelund receiving a tin plate because the Norwegians had just shot down their 100th German fighter or German aircraft, and that was of course Svein Heggelund's doing. So he received a tin plate, and I think it was champagne, because there's a photo of him with a champagne bottle in his back pocket. So some of these guys are totally making their mark, creating a names for themselves, while other guys, basically just as good, like The man you see, the guy you see middle left is Helge Sognes from Bergen. He was also a 331 squadron veteran. He had been with the squadron for the entire duration of the war. He was bound to go on a rest period in the summer of 1943, and like a few others, he just wanted to fly one more sortie, and he did, and that's when he was shot down and killed. And I think that some of these veterans really remember some of those incidents. And I took, it's a horrible photo, but it's one of the few. And but bottom right here is Rolf Arne Berg to your right, and then the one that would take over the squadron from Rolf Arne Berg, because Rolf Arne Berg was squadron leader during 43 and into late 43, and that's Arne Øystein, which also came from a town very close to me, so he's a bit local. So I've also done some research on him. So that's two squadron leaders of 331 squadron outside the officers' mess at North Wheel. So 1943, full effort, a fantastic job. They had losses, sadly, like these fighter squadrons had. But in general, they were doing really good work. And you have to also mention and think about the fact that the ground crews were a major part of that, being able to maintain these Spitfires in a proper way and a quick way, and keeping them in the air. So these pilots wouldn't really be able to be on top of the score sheets in the RAF if it wasn't for the Norwegian ground crew, consisting of these sailors and these escapees from Norway. So they have a lot of thank for them. I just wanted to, with all the fanfare and the victories, and 1943 being the year that it was for the Norwegian squadrons, there was also, sad incidents, and it's important to remember those things that didn't really go so well. And what you see here is to your left is Marius Eriksen's best friend. His name was Jan Løfsgaard. He was shot down by Focke-Wulfs in 1943, and he jumped out. They suspected that he was shot while in his parachute, but probably not the case. He was probably shot trying to escape. That was a loss that Marius Eriksen never really came to terms with. Another one is the half French Norwegian guy Peter Lockwood Overn, and he also lost his life in 1943 in combat with Focke-Wulfs. And there's a story about him, because he, being French, he was a bit perhaps different than some of the other Norwegians in his being French. So he received a lot of flack for that. One time I think his Spitfire ended up upside down for some reason, maybe due to combat. But with the Spitfire being upside down on the field, and he couldn't get out. So a fellow pilot, walked over to the Spitfire, and he knocked on the hood, and he said, "Hey, Lockwood, are you all right?" And he said, "Yeah." And then the pilot said, "Oh yeah, that's too bad," and then he left. So stories like these, without all the glamour and stuff, is also to be remembered. And then you had young guys like Johan here, far right picture. He never even got the chance to fight any Germans. He flew information with 332 Squadron over Cambridge, and his Spitfire was struck by lightning, and that was it. But I remember this quote by him in a letter back home, where he says, I can read it. "I do not care whether I will get through this or not, only that I know that I have laid a stone in the temple of freedom. I will strive towards that for as long as I can, because I have seen what repression means." And when I first read that left a mark on me, at least. That was in June 41, and he was killed in January 1943. Okay, going into 1944 now, and this will be mostly about Leif Lundsten, because I have done a lot of research on him and what happened to him that day. The Spitfire, on the other hand, is not a ground attack aircraft. They were still trying their best to use it as a ground attack aircraft, and they were practicing that in the spring of 1944. And Leif Lundsten took over the squadron from Arne Austen, and that was in January or February 1944. Leif Lundsten, he had been a test pilot with Supermarine for over half a year, so he had quickly become one of the most, an expert on Spitfires, not only for the Norwegians part, but he was one of the pilots in the RAF with most time flying Spitfires of them all. In all, I think he test flew around like 300 Spitfires. And there had been some complaints with the former squadron leader of 331 being Arne Austen. He apparently spoke poor English, and his navigational skills sometimes left something to be desired. So the squadron wasn't really happy when Leif Lundsten came back. But the change, according to his fellow pilots, was significant when he came back. So everyone was pleased having one of the the veterans of 331 squadron as their leader. And so going into D-Day, the Norwegians had to say goodbye to their home base at Northfield. They moved down south, and they would participate during D-Day. They flew 4 sorties that day. I think most of the pilots felt a bit disappointed because there weren't any Luftwaffe fighters around to shoot at. So they were mostly flying over the beaches, and I'm sure that made a huge impression on these young guys, seeing whatever went on the beaches and in the channel. If you see, take a look at the photo on your top right, you see Leif Lundsten in front of his Spitfire. I'm sure that's taken at Bug Nordregis, where they were stationed before D-Day. And most of the Norwegian pilots did that. They took one of these type of photos in front of the Spitfires because they expected to be killed during the invasion, and they really didn't really know what to expect. And so they took these photographs so their families would have something to keep if they never made it. And I think that many of them really didn't expect to be alive after D-Day. So it was when nothing happened, I'm sure they were a bit surprised, but it wouldn't last for long, because just a few days after D-Day, the guys for 331 and 332 squadron were flying a sortie over Utah Beach. It was around 9 o'clock in the evening. It was quite dark, gloomy. The cloud base was low. It was raining a little bit, and they were told by radio controller that there were Germans around. So they went inland. They were shot at from the ground. They didn't see any Germans, but they had to turn around and fly back the way they came from, because they were being fired upon by ground forces. And so what happened next was they were flying basically straight over the invasion fleet outside Utah and Omaha Beach. And there was a mix, from what I know, of US and British naval forces, and one ship opened fire and everyone else opened fire, and suddenly you had the entire invasion fleet firing at these 2 squadrons of Spitfires. And Leif Lundsten was in front, leading them, and he was hit. He knew what happened. He cursed him out. And the last they saw of Leif Lundsten was that he disappeared into the clouds with smoke pouring out of his engine, and no one really heard anything from him ever again. So that was the end of one of the popular 331 squadron leaders. And so a sad story, a sad ending to a fine young man. He was 25 years old when that happened. And I just a few years ago, I spoke to one of his relatives, and she told me how his mother kept repeating, in the years after the war, that she couldn't believe that Leif was dead. She just couldn't believe it, and you come quite close to history when you speak to relatives like that, and you understand that these guys, they were very much alive, just like you and me. They were just born a bit earlier. And this is where Norwegian Spitfire Foundation comes into the frame, but I'm going to tell the story about this first. What you see to the left is Carl Stausland. He was fighter pilot with 331, and this happened during the Christmas time of 1944. They got into a melee with some Focke-Wulfs, and that didn't happen that often in 44, because the Luftwaffe were basically nowhere to be seen anymore. So Stausland, he managed to shoot one of the Focke-Wulfs down, but straight after that happened, his number 2 overshot him, and they had a mid-air, which meant that Stausland had to emergency land his Spitfire in a field in Holland. And that's what you see in the photo here, painted by my father, actually. So that's where PL258 ended up, but it won't be the end of the story for this Spitfire, and I will talk about that a bit later on. Okay, going into 45. Spitfires flying ground roles, not the best idea. The Norwegians suffered greatly, and they had a lot of losses during 44 and 45, flying this type of sorties over Holland and Germany and Belgium and France. A lot of losses. I can't talk about them all, but I'm going to mention 2 of them, and I just have to mention Rolf Arneberg. He was, at that time, wing commander. He was leading 132 wing, which consisted of 3 squadrons, I think. And he probably had more hours flying sorties than any other pilot in the 2nd Tactical Air Force. He was a great leader. He was well liked. He, according to some of the ground crew, he was their golden boy. He was always the front and center of any type of party. Everyone liked him. And he was starting to get tired. This was February 1945. He had been flying as a wing commander since D-Day. However, there were reports coming in, I think this was in February, there were reports coming in about an airstrip in northern Holland where there supposedly were a lot of German aircraft on the ground. And Berg, he was actually off his duties because his bags were packed and he was off to Switzerland for vacation, and the war would be over for his part. But being him, and he was eager, he really wanted to fire his guns the last time. He asked Zulu Morris, which was one of the top brass of the 2nd Tactical, 2nd TAF, he wanted to participate in this sortie, and they agreed, so they let him go. So he flew alongside the guy that would be his replacement, Wing Commander Jon Rygg. So going into this airfield called Elde, Berg went in first. Did not lose his drop tank for some reason. He had always told everyone else to always drop your tank before going in. Did not do that. Went first in. The whole thing was a trap from the German side. Lots of ground fire. His left wing broke off, and he crashed into, I think it was a farmer's house, a barn or something like that. The Spitfire did not catch fire or anything, but Rolf Arneberg, he died instantly in that crash. Alongside like the loss of several others like Leif Rudsten, losing Rolf Arneberg really made a huge impact on the guys. Some of the ground crew and Rolf Berg being Rolf Berg, they refused to believe that he was gone, so they sat on some boxes and they were just sitting and waiting for him to come back. They could not believe that he was dead because this was Rolf Arne Berg apparently, and he would not. He was like no one could touch him, but the Germans finally got to him, and sadly he would lose his life. Bottom left is another sad loss, and this is Arne Øystein, which I have previously mentioned. He was the commanding officer of Mustang Squadron out of Bentwaters in England in May 1945, and this was 4th of May. So Arne Øystein, he had survived the entire war, and he had shot down like I think he shot down like 5, so he was an ace. So he was leading, and they were attacking some submarines outside of Kiel in Germany, and just like Rolf Arne Berg, Arne Øystein went in first. So he and then the submarines opened fire on him, and he just went straight into the ocean, and that was it for his squadron. They simply just turned around and left. And they knew what was up, and they knew that this was the last days of war. So sadly, Arne Øystein would not survive either. So going home, see, I'm basically on time. The photo you see in the background here is Wing Commander Jon Rygg and his squadron of Spitfires in Scotland, most likely, and they are on their way home. They would fly across the North Sea, and then they would fly information over the south of Norway, and then they would, most of them would land at Gardermoen airfield. And you can imagine what type of feelings that these boys had when they came back in their Spitfires after 5 years of occupation. Interesting for those Spitfire fans, you see that one of the Spitfire closest the wing is a clipped wing Spitfire. And so these guys were coming home, the war was over, and what you see here, horrible photo, but I think it's from a film. This is 331 Squadron's Ragnar Dogger. Apparently he met his mom when he landed, so I'm sure that would have been fun. So so that was it for the Norwegian effort over Europe. However, the problem with the Norwegian Spitfire squadrons after the war was that neither the population or the government really recognized their efforts and their sacrifices and the heroics and everything they had been through. The population, having suffered through 5 years of occupation, were quite harsh, and I know that a few of them experienced that people came up to them and asked, what the hell have you been doing for 5 years? Have you been just sitting in England drinking tea while we have suffered through all this occupation? And so they had they frankly had no clue what these boys had been through. And when there were parades in Oslo and during the May and the fighter pilots, they weren't even part of the parades, and I know that this a lot of them became bitter and disappointed and some of them even depressed because of the non-recognition that these pilots got. Some of them, this is like just a few pilots and what happened to them after the war. What you see here is Marius Eriksen to your left. He was shot down in 43. He survived. He spent 2 years in a German prison camp, and he came back. But I know that he suffered physically and mentally for as long as he was alive, and I think he passed away in 2009. The Olav Jønne, another 332 squadron pilot, he survived the entire war, only to lose his life a few years after in an airplane crash. Top left, top right, sorry, that's Finn Torsager. He became a Scandinavian Airlines captain, and he seemed to be doing all right. He passed away in 2000. And then you have bottom right is another top scoring ace. He later wrote a book about the mental strain and everything the Norwegian pilots had to go through and what they suffered with after the war. And this is where Norwegian Spitfire Foundation comes in, because if you remember PL258 flown by Carl Stausland, a couple of us went to Holland to see if we could find any parts of Spitfire PL258. Felt like a needle in a haystack type of thing. But they were extremely lucky and surprised when they managed to find parts of PL258, which apparently had been in the population it had been in possession of some Dutch farmers. So they managed to buy those parts, and that will serve as the core of the restoration of PL258. But restoring a Spitfire is not cheap. So we are always looking for donations and support in our effort, because what we want to do is use PL258 as a living memory to all those fighter pilots sacrificing so much for us during World War II. So that's the plan. And we have been active for quite a few years now. What you see in the brilliant photo by John Dibbs is NSF leader Lars Ness flying the Spitfire that we painted it as the old Farneberg's Spitfire from late 1944 with the roundel, but also the Norwegian flanks on the wings. Rolf Arneberg was not allowed to keep those colors, but it made for a fantastic looking aircraft. And I know that this type of color, that this scheme has been used in several computer simulations and all sorts. And it was an absolute honor to fly this Spitfire with those colors, and that was in 2017. And now onwards to our attempt to restore PL258. It's on the UK register, and we hope to be able to restore this. And I think that's about it. I have done pretty good with time, a bit over time, but that's it. Okay, questions?
Tor, thank you. You did a tremendous job. We've got plenty of questions coming in. I think one that would help us all out, though, is given that it is a bit of an overlooked piece of war history, and the work that you and the foundation are doing is shedding light on that. If we want to do some self-study, which of your books kind of represents a good starting point for people to kind of come off of this presentation and kind of get stuck into the material?
I would say that would be the one I called Viking Spitfire, which is the book about Finn Torsager. It's easily it's written in a sort of easy way for everyone to understand and read and stuff like that. And if you want to really dig in, you can also buy the one I called Spitfire Glory, which is about Leif Lundsten. But I would recommend going with Viking Spitfire first. Yeah.
So you mentioned that one of the challenges for these guys coming home was just this sort of lack of awareness of what they had done during the war. One question we did have to ask you was, how aware was the average Norwegian of what was going on? And, living in occupied Europe, access to information about the great record of this squadron and things like that, obviously, wasn't readily available. have they taken any steps in more modern times to properly recognize this history and to pay tribute to these aviators? We've seen the same thing happen here in the United States with different groups that contributed greatly to the war effort, getting kind of like late post-war recognition.
I'd say it's a work in progress. Um, we've gotten better, but there's always work to do. We've been lucky to have a journalist with an insane amount of knowledge about these guys. He's written several books in Norwegian, and he's done a lot for this effort. Um, uh, but trying to restore the Spitfire will be, a part of that work. So while I can't say I'm satisfied, but it's a work in progress. Yeah.
I think that's a good way to put it. You mentioned, some of the post-war lives of these men, becoming, Scandinavian Airlines pilots. One thing that you didn't mention that's kind of interesting, because we see it in a lot of kind of similar stories about, trained pilots returning to their countries in occupied Europe. Were any of these guys the basis for the post-war Norwegian Air Force? Is there still a 331 and 332 squadron in the Norwegian Air Force today?
Oh
Uh,
yeah. Oh yeah. I should have mentioned. Sorry. Well, yeah. Many of these guys served as the core foundation of the Royal Norwegian Air Force. And yes, there is still squadrons called 332 and 331 squadron. So we kept traditions like that. So a guy like Wilhelm Mohr, for example, which I mentioned, he was a huge part of it. So was top scoring ace Svein Heggelund. Rolf Arneberg would have been a part of it. So they formed the basis of those early years of the Royal Norwegian Air Force. Absolutely.
I think another question that kind of emerges anytime we hear these stories of the kind of allied collaborations happening in the war, was there like an independent Norwegian command structure that managed these units, or were they blended into the Royal Air Force? I guess for all intents and purposes, were the pilots RAF pilots who happened to be Norwegian, or were they Royal Norwegian Air Force pilots flying loaned airplanes?
Right. Another point I should have mentioned. We were embedded with the RAF, but we owned the planes. We had the merchant fleet, and we used the income of the merchant fleet to buy these Spitfires. So we were following the command of like David Scott Mullen and those guys. So we were embedded with RAF. We weren't a part of like the U.S. Air Force or anything. We were part of the RAF.
I think you hit on another important thing to mention, which is that the Norwegian merchant fleet played a tremendous role in the resupply of Britain and keeping those convoy lanes open. It even has it's a story of truth to place for us here, because Norwegian freighters off of the Outer Banks were some of the boldest in confronting U-boats in U.S. territorial waters. You don't often think that a freighter crew can do much to deal with a U-boat, but there are definitely stories of Norwegian freighter captains who knew what the U-boats were, what they were capable of doing, and how to take precautions against them in the early days of the war here in the US.
Yeah. And just to mention our sailors, and they didn't get a recognition they deserved after the war either. So it's sort of like all these sailors and the fighter pilots and the ground crew, and the sailors were a part of that too.
We've got a couple family connections, folks watching that have relatives who served with Norwegian units during the war or were trained in Little Norway in Canada. Is there a resource where we can direct people or connect them to learn more about their particular family connections, and maybe even what units their relatives served in?
Uh, I would ask one of the museums, maybe first and foremost, but it never hurts to put your name out there on Facebook and forums, and get in touch with people with a lot of knowledge, because a lot of us we really want to share. So there are records around, but I would Google a little bit around these museums and stuff like that. But talking to people with knowledge would maybe work the best. But there's a lot of work that has been done that might be not so it may not be easy to find at first glance.
I think that's a well-made point. So visiting the Norwegian Spitfire Foundation on Facebook, leaving a message there might be a good place to start with that. If you need help with that, you can always send us the information by email and we can forward it over to Tor, and perhaps he can help us find the right place. Tor, were there reprisals against the families of the men that left and went to England? I would assume that although the average Norwegian was not aware of the success these squadrons were having, that it was a bone of contention for the Germans, who were no doubt aware that they were losing airplanes to Norwegian pilots flying with the RAF. Did they go after their families or intern them or lock them up or anything like that?
I do not have any examples of it, but I'm sure it happened one way or another. I do know that some of these pilots lost their citizenship, so they went after the guys that escaped. But I am also sure that if you were a Pole, I'm sure they would come after those families a whole lot more. But I'm sure there's examples of that too here.
It sounded like you had a great series of opportunities to talk with these pilots, meet with their families, and like you said, it keeps a little bit of the history alive. Um, I think that probably citizens of countries occupied by the Nazis have an interesting perspective on D-Day and on the invasion at Normandy. Um, did they view it as, first steps in a long journey home? What did the return to continental Europe mean to Norwegians?
Yeah, good question. Well, in short, yes. They felt that the effort they did over France and during D-Day was part of that effort of freeing their own country. But I also know that Norwegians up in command and even government wanted to spare or save the Norwegian pilots for the invasion of Norway if that would come. And so these pilots did not see eye to eye with the government policy, so to speak, because the government was in exile in London and they had their own plans, and these pilots were not too keen on that. They just wanted to fight, and they wanted to fight where the fight was at, and that was over the continent.
You mentioned that one of the wing commanders was planning a vacation to Switzerland. You couldn't rotate home to Norway during the war. So how did they give these men time away from the front lines to sort of rest and recuperate? It sounded like a lot of the pilots you were describing were basically in it to win it. Were there and as part of the squadron for a substantial portion of the war.
Yeah, right. Well, you can call it a rest period, but um, if you take like 1943, vacation in a hotel wasn't like part of it. Some of them went to become instructors for a while. Some of them went to Canada for a while. Some of them became test pilots for a while. But once they came into Europe. Actually, I just saw a chapter in a book about that, and and then they could go to to Switzerland and live life a little bit. But rest periods, during most of the war years, were simply just doing something else. But I also know that British families also adopted a few of these Norwegian pilots. I'm sure other pilots too from other countries, and invited them to stay at their home or their mansions or whatever, just to recoup.
And I know it's getting late there, so we've got just a couple of questions remaining here.
Yeah, no
We
worries.
we won't have had a chance to get to all of them, so please know that the subject matter has stirred up quite a significant amount of interest in our webinar, folks. So thank you again for being here with us. But you mentioned that the ground crews were made up of Norwegian escapees and sailors. Were they exclusively Norwegian? And if so, can you talk about how they were trained and prepared? Were these escapees sent to Canada as well to prepare and train and then sent back to Europe?
I think some of them came to. I think most of them really wanted to become pilots, and so they went to Canada. Um, but just to answer your first question, no, we did have Swedes, we did have Danish crew. I know of Danish pilots, Swedish pilots, so I'm sure they were, part of the ground crew as well. But there were mainly a Norwegian force in the ground crew as well. But the Danish didn't have their own part of the RAF, so they simply just joined us.
I think that's a great answer to that question. Thank you for shedding some light on the operational realities of these kind of international units within the RAF. One final question kind of relates to those international units again. Why were they, in your opinion and in your research, why were they sent to train rather than retained in England to fight? You touched on at the beginning that they some of them were upset that they weren't able to participate, in defending the British Isles during the Battle of Britain. But other units made up of Polish pilots and so on, they did fly in the Battle of Britain. So what do you think the distinction or deciding factor was?
Political. I think they were just being cautious. I do not think that the Norwegian high command or the government really understood what was going on, because they should have known that if Britain fell, that would be it. But for some reason they felt they had too few pilots, and if you lost those pilots, there wouldn't be anyone left to train new pilots. I'm sure they thought along those lines. It's really hard to understand, once you know history and what went down. But no, like I said, the pilots did not agree to that decision at all. They simply wanted to fight, and they felt shameful for not being able to fight in the Battle of Britain. But no, when that said, there were very few people, very few pilots with enough capabilities and training in 1940 to actually be able to do anything. Coming into late 1940, I believe that some Norwegian pilots were left to gain some experience with the RAF, and especially going into 1941, but none participated in the Battle of Britain.
Well, Tor, I know it's late there. We're going to go ahead and let that kind of round out our presentation for today. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Tor, for being here with us, and sorry for keeping you up so late.
Oh, no worries. I hope you liked it.